Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. It takes a lot to be a leader. It takes more to be a great leader. And it takes incredible commitment to be an outstanding leader. What is that thing that can make the difference? While there are many qualities that contribute to being a great leader, possibly the most salient is being incredibly aware or conscious. And that's where this episode's guest comes in. Carter Phipps wrote a book called Conscious Leadership with two other authors, one of whom was Steve McIntosh, and the other was John Mackey, the CEO and founder of Whole Foods. I love this book, and I'm not alone. Forbes said it is based on the leadership John Mackey used to reach the top of the business world and do plenty of good in the process. Conscious Leadership serves as a user-friendly text that is easy to implement to improve leadership from the top all the way down. It appears that the intention of this book is not merely to boost those who are at the top, but to positively impact all stakeholders within an organization. Carter has written another book called Evolutionaries and hosts a podcast called Thinking Ahead. He has a deep understanding of conscious leadership, and following the ideas he shares may positively influence attrition, morale, external perception, and a host of other important factors of well-being of any organization. Carter Phipps, welcome to Super Psyched.
Great to be on, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I loved your book, Conscious Leadership. It's such a refreshing book. I agreed with everything you wrote. And to think that, yeah, and there were so many hyperlinks between what you wrote and other podcast episodes corroborating what you wrote, and new ideas and new ways of expressing ideas that are so important. And you kept the cookies nice and low on the shelf so that it was really intelligible, that somebody could read it and actually use it as a playbook.
That's great you say that, because we made a lot of effort to make it very accessible, but not to dumb it down, to keep it, and also to throw a lot of interesting perspectives at the reader so they would have a lot of things to sort through and to find interesting, but not too esoteric, not too hard to read, not too intellectual, but rigorous and interesting. And anyway, trying to exactly, you said better than I did. That's great.
And very compelling. The vignettes were great. And
lots of stories. Try to keep it full of good stories.
So yeah, and you're a writer, and in addition to Conscious Leadership, which is the book we're going to be discussing today, you've written Evolutionaries and received praise from the media, from modern luminary thinkers. You've really hit it out of the park. You attracted the great John Mackey, the former CEO of Whole Foods.
The CEO, believe it or not. Still the CEO. I mean, we'll see how much longer, but even with the Amazon merger, he stayed for the last 4 years. So he's still there.
I didn't realize. I thought he was okay. That's very cool. Yeah. And I'm just appreciating, I've gotten to speak with you offline, and you seem to be a very deep thinker and a seeker of greatness and truth. And I'm just wondering, what has your path been as a person who's been such a student of greatness and truth? Can you describe a little bit of that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I certainly haven't had one path. I mean, I think we talk about being a generalist in the book, and I'm a generalist definitely by nature. I've done a lot of things in my life and I've pursued a lot of different paths. I think in the early part of my life, I was really a seeker of truth in a very spiritual sense. And initially in an Eastern spiritual sense. I mean, I think in my 20s, I spent time in India. I was part of a spiritual community. I did a lot of meditation and practice. And I really pursued the spiritual life with the most intensity I could muster. But then in my 30s, and as I sort of had a different kind of intellectual awakening, I was an editor of a magazine called What is Enlightenment, and that was pursuing kind of the big questions of life. And I didn't lose my interest in spirituality. I still maintain that today. I have a lot of passion for that, interest in that. But I think I got very interested in human culture and the evolution of culture, whereas maybe in my earlier period, I was more interested in the evolution of consciousness and the individual consciousness. And later on, I got interested in how that evolution of consciousness applies to the evolution of culture. How does culture evolve? And I got interested in history and interviewed people from all different walks of life, and just very interested in how culture develops and evolves and changes. And I think during that time, I worked in the corporate world for a while, but also as part of that, got interested in business and capitalism and modernity and the impact it's had on human culture. And so in some ways, this book combines a lot of those interests. It combines
right.
So the interest
as I was reading it.
Individual development, evolution, leadership, in cultural development, evolution, in the modern world, in capitalism and business. It kind of brings all those together. So.
I really felt it. And I appreciated how you had so much range. We'll be talking about the concept of things that aren't necessarily invented here and how you might be able to make them front and center in American modern management and how it might actually benefit both the individual and the group at large. I'm wondering if you could describe point blank, what is conscious leadership?
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea of conscious leadership is that obviously leadership is important. It's important in any institution, any dimension of life. It's important right now, maybe as much as it's ever been. Of course, it's always been important. And it's important in business. I mean, the book is mostly about business, but leadership applies to all walks of life. It applies to nonprofits, to governments, to any institution. But I think the foundational idea of conscious leadership is that, okay, some people are born great leaders. They are naturally great leaders. We open the book with Lincoln. I mean, I think we can maybe say that about Lincoln. It's like maybe they have that kind of built in their operating system in some way. But for the rest of us, for people, for everyone else who aspires to good leadership and to great leadership, we have to kind of take up the challenge of our own development. We have to kind of consciously think about and pursue and explore and try to understand what makes a great leader and try to develop ourselves to learn and grow and develop into those leaders we want to be. We can't assume that we just naturally will be. And so that effort to take up our own leadership challenge and leadership development and leadership journey consciously is kind of the core idea of conscious leadership. And so that book is really exploring all the various principles and ways in which we might take up that challenge.
I love that idea. And it seems that a big part of that is perpetually being willing to take on new ideas to increase who you are.
Yeah.
Does that sound correct?
Totally. Yeah, exactly. And I think, we talk in the book about we're living longer. There is more of a recognition in our era of adult development and how adults grow and learn and develop. And I think that sense that, okay, we're not stuck with who we are at 25 or 30 or even 35 or 40. We're just not, thank God for me,
Yeah.
We talked earlier. For those of us who tried to really change our lives and later in our lives in our 30s and 40s and 50s, thank God, because we can learn and grow. We can develop in the late bloom of adulthood. And that's an important concept. So taking up that journey and saying, we're not just going to become something early in our life and then sort of coast the rest of the way. Obviously, we're taking up that journey of change and development in all its manifestations. That's a huge part of the message of the book. Leadership is a journey. It's not a destination, and it's not something we achieve.
It's something that's perpetually evolving.
Exactly.
And I love that idea. It seems that leadership as usual is what I'm going to call it as a contrast to, say, conscious leadership. I suppose one could say unconscious leadership, but I'm just going to call it leadership as usual.
Yeah, right.
It is maybe I learned this in business school. This is how it works, and this is how I'll be.
Right.
But I'm wondering, how would you contrast in your words? Those were mine, but I'm just kind of wondering in your words, what would leadership as usual look like as a contrast?
Well, I just think there have been efforts, leadership is a huge category. There's countless books about leadership, understandably. And I think there's been a lot of efforts and some dramatically successful efforts to kind of quantify what makes a great leader. And some of those have been fantastic. And some of those are timeless.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are probably a bit dated. And so in some ways, we're putting this book into a well-worn genre of leadership, but I think over the last several decades here, we've learned a lot about leadership. We learned a lot about development, learned a lot about business. We learned a lot about people. We learned a lot about teams. We learned a lot about personalities. There's a lot of information to bring that wasn't maybe there when Stephen Covey wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People or what. And nothing against that. That was an iconic book
Great book
for the time, and great book. And it's so relevant all kinds of ways, I'm sure.
Couldn't agree more.
There's aspects of, in our first 3 chapters, we talk about integrity and love and purpose. And some of those aspects of those virtues are timeless. They haven't changed a tremendous amount. But there are a lot of other things that have changed, and we have learned more. And so we're also trying to update this whole genre for this time and this era.
One of the things that I've actually been exposed to is books about leadership that espouse darker arts, manipulation, being opaque, gaming, and other ways to rock power.
That's fascinating.
And you take the opposite approach. Thankfully, I do not in any way, shape, or form endorse the darker arts in management. I think they're terrible. But as somebody who works with Silicon Valley executives, I hear reports of the use of these darker arts sometimes. Sometimes my brain feels like it's going to explode when I'm hearing the horrible things. And
That's
I'm just
very interesting.
And I was so glad to see this book. It really talks about transparency and building up teams while you build up yourself, and constantly improving your tool of management, even through sleep and reading and geeking out, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. But I was just so happy about that.
I appreciate that. That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, obviously you can practice. I'm sure you can practice some of those darker arts. That's a way to put it, and have some success. But at the end of the day, we're not just trying to kind of carve out our own little piece of the mountain. We're trying to uplift the subtitle. We're trying to elevate humanity through business. I hope that's what we're trying to do. If that's what we're trying to do, we're trying to do something else. And you certainly can be successful this way. I'm not saying you can't be successful in other ways, but I know you can be successful this way. And I feel like for business to take its place, and capitalism too, to take its place as an institution that really continues to uplift humanity and continues to be on balance a more positive force than negative, it's going to take more and more people to take up this kind of banner. And I think that's important.
Couldn't agree with you more. Some of the other things you talked about were the Beatles and this kind of equilibrium that people can strike between competition and collaboration. Could you speak about competition and collaboration as they relate to conscious leadership?
This is one of my favorite examples. I've used this before. I had a whole chapter on this subject in Evolutionaries, which is not in the context of leadership, in the context of evolution. We talk about this idea of polarity management in the book, which is it's become a sort of fashionable management idea recently. And it has some important elements to it. And one of those important elements is that there are certain type of polarities that are what you might call win-lose polarities. You want one, you don't want the other. You want wealth, you don't want poverty. You want, good and evil. That's obviously very Manichaean, but those are certain types of polarities, right?
Sure.
But there are other polarities that are what we call positive polarities. So that means that both sides are important. Both sides are healthy. But if you have an imbalance of everything on one side or everything on the other side, the system becomes unhealthy. Our political system can be like that, right?
Sure. I'm actually even thinking of a bird with 2 wings that they should be of equal weight in order for the bird to fly.
For the bird to fly, or for us to walk forward, you need both legs to walk forward.
Yeah,
right? You need this system to work well, to be healthy altogether. And we have a number in the book of examples like that. But competition and collaboration are one of the best examples of that. And I use the Beatles because it's just like, what made the Beatles incredible? They had this beautiful collaborative power, right? Because they practiced together for years and years, and it was just the way they played together was beautiful. But that wasn't enough. What also made them great was that you had this competitive dynamics. They were trying, you had John and Paul trying to outdo each other all the time. They were competing against each other to some degree, and they were trying to outdo each other and just trying to make a better song. And they're trying to make a better. And that competitive fire to get ahead, to express oneself, to be creative, that's a big part of what creativity is about. And so we can't tamp down our creative, competitive instincts either. And so competition is important. And sometimes in our sort of conscious age, you see people want to emphasize collaboration all the time and, working together and collaborative instincts. And that's fantastic. There's nothing wrong with that. But we don't want to emphasize that at the expense of our competitive instincts, because those are important too. But if we just are competitive, then it becomes a kind of Darwinian dog-eat-dog world. And that's not what we want either. And that's not good for healthy team dynamics. So again, getting that balance between collaboration and competition, then you get these healthy team dynamics. You got creative, competitive people striving to do better and better. And yet they're working together and there's a team culture and you have this kind of power. So understanding polarities and how to work with polarities is a really important part of conscious leadership.
So what advice would you give to somebody who wants to be competitive, but not hostile? How do you be competitive in the right way?
I'm a very competitive guy in a lot of ways. I played sports growing up. I was a tennis player and a wrestler. And anyone who plays sports with me knows I'm pretty competitive. But beyond that, there's something also in the competition is not just trying to beat the other person or trying to beat down the other person. Anything like it's also, there's something in the competitive spirit that's trying to outdo oneself. That's trying to do better and better. That's trying to, in the artistic sense, also trying to be more creative and do something that outdoes what one has done before, and to transcend one's own, to get the most out of one's own capacity. So there's all these really healthy aspects of what competition is. So I just think when it then falls into a kind of a negative sort of trying to, be like you say, some hostility to another person, or trying to beat oneself up for not succeeding, or trying, there's all kinds of ways it can grow unhealthy, certainly. But part of the way we do that is we remember that there's a very healthy, positive core to the competitive spirit.
Love that. And some people may listen and kind of with some skepticism say, okay, that's all well and good, this whole conscious leadership idea, but show me the money. Does this actually yield profits? Will the shareholders be happy with conscious leadership? Can you give any evidence to why it might be a good idea, even from a bean counter's perspective?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we had lots of examples in the book of business operating in this way, of a kind of, what conscious capitalists would call maybe a kind of a stakeholder focus on our business. And we don't say there's no success. This is the only way to be successful in business. I'm sure there's other ways to be successful. I think this is the best way to be successful in business, And it's not that you can't be successful in other ways, but if you have the choice, why not lead this way? Why not lead with love? Why not have integrity and be successful that way? And not only that, because when you do that, and when you have what we call the stakeholder focus, where you aren't just focused on profits, or you aren't just focused on shareholders, enriching shareholders, those are important. There's nothing wrong with making money, making profits, earning market share, all those things. Those are important. Those are a huge part of business.
I would say it's actually essential. You're not going to be in business if you don't have it.
Yes, This is it's like another polarity, right? Purpose and profits, right? Absolutely essential. But is it the purpose of what you're doing in the first place? Is it the purpose of, if you're an entrepreneur, is it the purpose of why you got into business? Is it what the business is doing fundamentally? And I was saying, well, no, it's part of what is serving the purpose of the business. Profits are absolutely essential to grow and serve the purpose of the business. But is there a deeper, higher purpose of business? For most businesses, the answer is unequivocally yes. And understanding that, discovering that, seeing what that is absolutely critical. And not only that, in all kinds of ways, if you are serving all of the very stakeholders of your business, your employees, your customers, your investors, your shareholders, the people in your community, when times get rough, and they will, those people will be much more likely to support you.
Sure.
They'll be much more likely to help. They'll be much more likely to be the kind of voices for support of the business that will serve everyone. So it's like, and we have examples of that in the book too, of how that works. So there's a win-win proposition in there that makes a difference.
And what are some companies, can you describe some companies who are absolutely crushing it with conscious leadership and making just really good, that are hockey stick looking reports?
There's some great stories in the book. And one of my favorite ones is, and people probably won't know this, is a Costa Rican company that's led by a name you read about, Ramon Mendiola. And it's a great example of, and it's a very specific context, because this is a big company in Costa Rica, very different context in the US, who he began to realize his responsibilities as being a kind of flagship company in the country. He had more responsibilities than just to gain market share and increase profits. He had responsibilities to the whole stakeholders. And if he was ultimately going to be successful, going to have people support him in all kinds of ways, going to have the government support, consumer support, he realized he needed to have this kind of stakeholder focus. And we tell the journey that he went on as he developed that, and the battles he had to fight to do it, and then ultimately the success he had. And I just think the company is called Fifco. It's a fantastic example of a company that really employed a lot of these principles and a leader that really pushed to make the company an example. And he really succeeded. So anyway, it's a more obscure example, but we've heard about many of the conscious companies in America. So it's fun to feature one outside America.
Name a few of them, because some people may be listening thinking, yeah, but does it really work over here? Who are some of the companies that really exemplify leadership? In a simple way, we list off we use a lot. I think different companies in different ways exemplify different principles that we have. A company like Whole Foods, obviously, we use Whole Foods in all kinds of ways, because of, John Mackey's the co-author. So of course, he's telling stories about Whole Foods and the different practices they've done. But you can look at other companies. A lot of people use Southwest as an example. I love that company.
Again, I don't know the inner workings of that company as well. So I feel like I can't speak to. Do they exemplify every principle in their book? Sure. They may or may not. But they're certainly someone who's been at the lead of doing things like that. And then certain companies you see, they're fantastic on one or two of the principles in the book. Maybe they're fantastic in innovation. Some of the tech companies, you work in Silicon Valley, right? Sure. You see companies in Silicon Valley who are fantastic in innovation.
Sure.
But they're not necessarily, they haven't been as good at keeping all their stakeholders, or not even realizing sometimes all their stakeholders they have, how important those stakeholders are. And then suddenly they're waking up and say, oh my God, we have all these people who we haven't been serving well enough. Now we have to change to make sure we're serving our customers better. We're serving our stakeholders in the society better. So some are waking up to that challenge, partially because they've grown so fast. There's all kinds of reasons. But again, I think you have certain companies that exemplify certain principles in the book and then don't exemplify other principles.
Sure, that makes sense. And I love the fact that...
Amazon, which owns Whole Foods now, is a great, incredibly innovative company. But they don't necessarily exemplify all of the other principles in the book.
Sure. And I think REI is closed on Black Friday so that people can be with their families. So
I think and I love that. That was a great story in the book. Yeah, REI is a great company.
And they're doing great. And there are a lot of other companies who I think are just really rocking it from a conscious leadership perspective.
We interviewed the Motley Fool. They're, again, very interesting company, an investment company, right? Sure. Not the company where you think, well, they're doing this high purpose. But again, just a company's doing fascinating things, and then the way they serve their customers, but the way they serve employees too. It's just really, companies really, again, not in an area where you think, well, that's just full of high purpose. Sure. It's just how to invest. But exactly. They've really created a very conscious, employee-centric company in a very interesting way. A fun company, an interesting company.
Love that. And I love the idea of imbuing fun into the system and the ROI associated with imbuing fun. I want to also ask you about the word stakeholder. How do you define that?
So when we say stakeholder, what we mean is the different elements in the ecosystem of a business that have an interest in the outcomes and the success of the business.
Sure.
That's not just the management team, and it's not just the board of directors, and it's not just the shareholders, and it's not just the employees, and it's not just the community around the business that live around the business and the families of the employees. And it's not just the environment. And, the environment is a stakeholder of many businesses, a very important stakeholders, right? The ecology around the business. And so it's not just any one of those, but it's all of those. It's that whole system, the whole community. And so one way to think about a business is sort of an expression of a whole community that it's serving. And the greater the success of that business is, the greater the success of that community. That all of that community has a stake in the success of the business. And for the business to be successful in the way we're talking about, it has to understand its responsibility to all the stakeholders in that community, in that ecosystem. It doesn't mean at times, maybe the employees will become very important and there'll be something that's really important that it needs to serve the employees, or the customers, maybe it loses track of its customer. So it has to focus on serving the customers. At times, any different element in that ecosystem could become heightened. The importance of it could become heightened.
Sure.
But ultimately has to be aware of all of those stakeholders.
And I love that idea of an ecosystem and stakeholders, because I think about the butterfly effect and how little things really make a big difference.
Yeah.
You had a great quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Can't pronounce it very well.
Yeah, right. That's a good quote.
But he was the author of The Little Prince. And I just wanted to quote him because I think so much of what you wrote is really about this quote. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Ooh, so poetic and so spot on for creating a thirst for employees to excel. I think that's just so brilliant.
That's in the purpose chapter. And that sense of, as we say, all businesses to some degree, and hopefully to a greater degree, they create value. Mm-hmm. That they're creating value and people are appreciating their value, and then they're purchasing, in some ways having a transaction with that value that's been created. And we think of businesses, in a transactional sense sometimes. But the deeper part of what's happening is they're creating value and clients and customers are appreciating that value. So in that value creating activity is a deeper purpose of a business. And if the business can get beyond just the transactional part, which is obviously important, selling goods and services, making money, expanding and growing, that's fine. That's a big part of what a business is. But if you can see underneath the layer of what's happening, you're creating value that people are appreciating in the marketplace. And in that value creating activity is some kind of purpose. So as you say, REI is not just selling great gear, right? They're serving a love of the outdoors, right? That's what they're doing ultimately. And so as a business, if you can appreciate what you're really doing, it's like I saw this great interview with Mark Cuban the other day with the Dallas Mavericks, and he was talking about our product's not just a basketball game. Our product is the joy you get when a father and a son come to see the team they love compete, right? That's so it's a different, how we see the value creating activity of the business is very important to how we see the purpose of the business. And so if we can identify that deeper purpose, and in that deeper purpose, the more we can identify that and bring that out, the more we get beyond just the transactional nature of the business. And actually there's an inspirational quality that everyone can get on board. You can yearn for the vast and endless sea instead of just chopping wood and using a hammer.
Totally.
That's a different thing. It's just a different thing. And so the best businesses understand that, and they all get behind that. And even in the way they communicate with themselves internally, but also externally with the public, they're focused on that to some degree. So,
and Simon Sinek beautifully talks about getting to the why of the matter. Like, why is this important? Right. And there's the, commonly cited parable of the bricklayers. A man walks by and sees three bricklayers, asks each of them what they're doing. The first one says, I'm laying bricks. The second one says, I'm building a building. And the third one says, I'm building a house of worship where communities will come together and people will find their best self.
Exactly. There you go. Perfect example, right? Another example.
Just the why of what we're doing.
Well, people say, like, what is the purpose? How do I get to purpose? And you have to look at beyond the transaction, what's the value you're creating? And ultimately, I feel like those businesses are also that are focused on, one of the chapters is called Innovate and Create Value. And it's very specifically called that way because to the extent that we are focused on, as I said, the success of modernity and capitalism is much more about creating how we create value than it is about allocating capital. You can be great at allocating capital, but I don't care how good you are. Unless the business is creating value over time, it will slowly decline.
So well put. Back in the 80s, there was a great book called Swim with the Sharks Without Being Eaten Alive by Harvey Mackay. And his basic premise was anyone can close a single deal.
Yeah.
The question is, can you create a relationship?
Yeah, right.
Because the shark will close a deal and leave and not maintain a relationship, and that business will die.
Isn't that interesting? I find that fascinating. I used to find this I used to love to watch Shark Tank. We talk about Shark Tank a little bit in the book.
Mark Cuban.
But I found it very interesting in that show. And I just think it's a lesson in life. And it's true. It's like, there's always people who are good at winning the deal.
Yes.
And okay, that's a cool skill in life. I acknowledge it. Sometimes the people are really good at that. They're great at getting 51 cents or 55 cents on the dollar in every deal. And that's a talent. Okay. But for the rest of us, it can be an irritating talent. And it's not a talent that builds relationships over time. It's not a win-win talent. And it's not a talent that's going to make you beloved on the next deal and the next deal and the next deal. Those great leaders we exemplify are often not just the deal winners. They may do fine on deals, but they're the ones who are going to, as you say, create the relationship and do 10 deals or 20 deals instead of the one where they alienate the person. They may win the deal, but they alienate that person. And so how do you do that? How do you create that win-win sensibility? How do you do 20 deals and 100 deals instead of one? And what I always liked about Shark Tank is, look, I love Mr. Wonderful on there and he's a great guy, but he's very much in that kind of, I'm going to win this deal, And what I always liked about Cuban was Cuban has this quality in Shark Tank where he cares about the person. Are they going to be a good entrepreneur? And can he really work with them? And is it a great idea? And then like whether or not he gets the extra cent out of them on the deal, he didn't really care about. He cares about the overall thing. And I always thought that was interesting. Whereas some others, you can see they care about, did I get the best deal here or not? It's just interesting.
That's so
a
awesome.
Different mindset.
And the thing that turned me on about Harvey Mackay in particular was he was selling a commodity, to my understanding. He was just selling envelopes, and envelopes could be bought anywhere. And he was able to create relationships with people, and they bought it. They bought them from him. And I think that's great. I want to pivot a little bit. You come up with, of course, I love a win-win. One of the most beautiful things. You actually went 50% more. You said a win-win-win, 3 wins. Can you talk about what is win-win-win?
In a win-win, both sides, ideally, if you're across the negotiation table, both sides will win on that deal. But what we did in the book was he said, okay, that's important in that those relationships, you want win-win deals. But there's another side to it, which is, do the people around that deal? Does when I talked about the community of stakeholders earlier, does the community of stakeholders also win? Are we including them in what it means to win on that deal? So a win-win-win is I win, you win, but then also the community around us wins. And so that third element sort of bring up, is what helps uplift everyone, not just you and me. It's not win-lose. It's not just you and me winning, but is this the best deal for our whole community of stakeholders? And I think that it brings another element to it. So that's what we're trying to get at.
And I think it's so essential. I think it could even be made into a bumper sticker that should be omnipresent just to remind us of that idea. I had the pleasure of interviewing the VP of People of Tile, very forward-thinking company that has just an incredibly high retention rate and satisfaction rate. And she was talking about how all boats rise in that type of win-win-win. She didn't use that term, but you've got friends out there. That's all I guess what I'm saying.
That's good. Well, I'm telling you, look, the stakeholder capitalism is becoming such a term these days. And it's like there's so many people are trying to get at this. Now, you can argue about, is it sort of, some kind of greenwashing, or is it just trying to make their businesses look better and trying to improve the PR of businesses? Yeah, sure. Sometimes it's trying to do that. But there are people out there who are really focused on making business more ethical and uplifting it. And I think, that's what we're trying to get at. But I think that is a genuine movement. That is happening. Conscious capitalism as a movement is growing, but it's not just conscious capitalism. There's a lot of sub-movements around the country and around the world that are getting at these ideas and trying to implement them and trying to show how they work. And it's a positive thing.
I love it. And you mentioned love earlier, and I'm going to go there with you because I don't think I've ever seen a management or leadership book that used the word love in the way you did. Could you share what that means? Love in the context of leadership.
There's a chapter in the book called Lead with Love. And, we talk about many different elements of what that means. And we talk about servant leadership, which is an old idea in management. And we talk about that idea that you're not there to be the guy at the center of everything or the person at the center of everything. You're there to sort of serve everyone else being successful. And that fundamental position, it's not about you. It's not about your ego. That fundamental position of being a servant of the success of the people around you and the organization around you. But we also talk a lot about the different elements of love. And, I think one of the things that we sort of lamented was that the way in which business so often gets framed by both the critics of business, but also even some of the supporters of business as being this kind of Darwinian metaphors, as being this kind of Darwinian story of people just, out competing the other person. And of course, as I said earlier, I'm not here to tell you that's not part of the story. But sometimes when we just constantly use war metaphors and Darwinian metaphors for business, we forget that a big part of business is like banding together with a team of brothers and sisters to achieve something that's very difficult and to deliver value into the marketplace and come up with new ideas and innovate in all kinds of ways and make other people's lives easier. And, we forget that and to succeed. And we forget that that's also a big part of what business is. And so what does it mean to have, John likes to use this term, love needs to come out of the corporate closet.
I love
because what is all of that, but a kind of way of loving each other and sharing the journey with each other. And one of the things Whole Foods does that I find really sweet is they have this, just a simple thing, but again, it makes a difference. is they have what they call appreciation. So at the end of meetings, they'll often do something where they say, does anyone want to appreciate anyone? And it gives everyone a chance to sit back for a moment and to say something positive about someone else, to appreciate something they did, something little they did, something big they did. And they do this on a regular basis as part of their corporate culture. And little things like that, it's not a big thing. It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't take a lot of energy. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It doesn't take a management seminar. But it's to do appreciations like that, but it gets everyone focused on what they appreciate about their fellow team members, what they appreciate about their own culture, how much they love other people, and how much they enjoy sharing the bonds they share. Of course, you can focus on other things as well at times, and sometimes maybe you have to. But little things like that can make a huge difference in kind of bringing a different level of camaraderie and appreciation and love and gratitude into the workplace. And wouldn't we all appreciate that?
You know, and we have such a negativity bias in our brains. We are really genetically programmed because of our ancestors who would have died if they didn't have that bias to look for what's wrong. Yeah. It really overrides that tendency of the negativity bias to look for what's good.
Yeah. Find someone doing something right.
Find someone doing something right and make that the common denominator.
Exactly.
As well. And it's not that misery loves company. Misery loves miserable company. And if you can find people finding, of course, workspace appropriate love as a common denominator, wow, wouldn't that be novel?
Yeah, absolutely.
You got to work with John Mackey. This is rarefied era to get to be up close, intimate, and personal with one of the most successful people who's ever lived. What was that like to work so closely with him?
John is a really, it was great to work with him. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to do the book with him. And I mean, he's a guy who obviously changed the culture in a way. I mean, you know, he's one of these entrepreneurs, not only built a great business, but it was almost more than that. I mean, Whole Foods became a kind of icon of the natural foods movement, and it helped really focus all of our attention on eating better and natural foods, organic foods, and the importance of that. They rode that wave, but they also helped create that wave. And that's a unique position for him to be in. But it was great. It was great to work with John. He was easy to collaborate with in many ways. And I mean, he's a very interesting guy. One of the things I love about John is the way in which he practices many of the principles. And I just mentioned a couple. I mean, the appreciation thing, for one thing, you know, he does that himself. You know, he practices that himself. He implements that himself. I've been at dinners with John and various friends, and we'll do appreciations at the dinner as instead of a prayer to start, you know, just to go around and do appreciations. You know, it's just like he really practices that and loves doing that. Another element is, you know, one of the chapters in the book is continuously learn and grow. And we talk a lot about the importance of just keeping a fresh and open mind. And one of the things I've appreciated about John is, like, I don't know how many times I've mentioned a book, or I said this book or that author, and he'll say, oh, I've read that. You know, I mean, the guy is a serious reader. I mean, he reads and reads and reads. And he reminds me of that, you know, we have that great Charlie Munger quote where he says, you know, all leaders are readers, you know.
I actually have that written down.
That's
so it's
great.
like,
well,
I have to say, not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers. I love that. So true.
I mean, John is a total expression of that. I feel like sometimes I got to just up my game to keep up, you know, with his voracious iPad in which he's got every book in the world. But yeah. So anyway, it was great to work with.
Yeah. And I'm sitting in front of you right now, and you've got a huge bookshelf behind you. You're a writer, and clearly you're very well read. And we talked a little bit about David Epstein's idea of range, and clearly the Charlie Munger and perhaps even Harry Truman quote. I think both of them said something to that effect. I love the idea of being well read and applying that, not just reading and knowing stuff, but actually using the stuff you read. Yeah. And it sounds like John is a paragon of reading and actually changing the way he thinks regularly. Yeah,
I really think he's someone who's done that throughout his life and continues to do it. And it's just so important. It's so important for all of us. I mean, just, you know, I'm sure I'm in my early 50s now, and I just think of the things I've learned in the last 10 years, you know, what I understand about life and myself and the world. And a lot of that comes through life experience, but it's life experience combined with reading widely and understanding more about the world, understanding how other people think, understanding the new ideas that have come into culture, and then understanding history too. Understanding history. It's all of that. It's all of that combined. And I think, and then being able to kind of integrate that and find meaning in that, and to be able to, I just think it's a real skill to be able to read widely and then bring that to bear on one's life and one's circumstance. And it's so important. we talk about being a generalist in the book, as you said, David Epstein's book. It's so important to be a generalist. I think it's real talent. Some people are going to be naturally more that than others. And I will say, look, obviously you can have a superficial understanding of all kinds of things, and maybe that's not going to help you, but we all have to be experts in certain areas. It's important that you understand what expertise is, because that's the only way you can really understand what you know and don't know in other areas. And understand what you don't know is important as understanding what you know.
For sure.
I'm absolutely all for expertise. Understanding deep expertise is a critical thing. But being able to employ, but we don't live in a world that is as isolated as where the disciplines are as isolated as they are on an academic campus. And that's fine that they are on an academic campus, but in the real world, things cross over, and we have to bring insights from other areas into this area, and we see how it applies. And the capacity to be a generalist is essential to being a developed human being, and certainly to being a great leader.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm thinking about the Talmud, and one of the ways that if I understand it correctly, is the Talmud looks at a single idea from as many perspectives as possible. Mm-hmm. And that is the entire basis of this podcast itself.
Yeah, right.
The Super Psych podcast is an attempt to look at psychology from as many expert opinions, from as many vantage points as possible.
Yeah.
And you're lending your ideas. And one of the ideas I actually want to go with further, you mentioned it earlier, is the idea of the servant leader. I think this may be one of the most important ideas in your book. I just recently had the pleasure of interviewing the DA, the chief law enforcement officer of Santa Clara County, and he is the epitome of a servant leader, and his results are showing that. But I'm wondering, could you explain what is a servant leader?
So, the servant leadership is an idea we talk about. I've lost my remembering of the guy who originated it, and anyone can look it up. It's somewhat of an idea that's been around for a couple decades in leadership. And again, it's the idea of, it's not always about me being the pathfinder and being out in front, and about me celebrating my ego and my ability to kind of lead the way. Sometimes leadership is about being able to serve other people's leadership and other people's success, and being the person behind the scene, being the person who doesn't have to be in the limelight, who doesn't have to be seen to be at the head of everything, and is simply there for the success of the whole enchilada, and is serving the success of the whole enchilada. And I think it came out of a Hermann Hesse, right? Or this is where I think Leo, is it Steppenwolf?
I think you mentioned Steppenwolf.
Yeah, where Steppenwolf and where Leo they're all on a journey together, and I'm going to do this poorly because I've read the book, but it was 4 decades ago or something, 3 decades ago.
Sure.
But Leo comes on the journey with them, and he's this very charismatic, interesting figure, but he's just part of the group. And they only realize toward the end of the journey, after he leaves, I believe, I don't remember the whole story exactly, that he was in fact the leader in a way, but because he was such a servant leader that he was helping them. He was absolutely essential to the success of the journey. And so it was through the inspiration of that book that and I can't remember his name, wrote the book on
Robert K. Greenleaf, somebody like that? Yeah,
Greenleaf, that's it. Yeah. Greenleaf wrote the book on servant leadership, but it was kind of inspired by that idea that sometimes we don't even know maybe who the person, but are you having the success you need to have? Are you serving in the way you need to serve, whether or not it's ever about you or not?
And I think there's something so powerful about removing your ego and focusing on the work. I recently heard a great interview with Darcy Carden, who plays the role of Janet on The Good Place.
Yeah, and I love that. I like
she was something of a late bloomer in terms of really hitting it big in acting.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she said was her recipe for success was just focusing on the work.
Yeah.
And that just blew my mind, focusing on the work itself.
That's cool.
And kind of taking your ego out of it. Yeah. And I think a servant leader does that to some extent. Focuses on the work, lets the best idea win, takes him or herself out and saying, let's really focus on the ecosystem.
In my life, we talked before the call a little bit. People won't notice it about me necessarily. I was part of a spiritual community for a while. And in that one of the things you see in very intensive, where there's a lot of intensive spiritual practice. And one of the things you see in a community like that is you see a lot of people jockeying for power.
Yeah.
In a little close-knit community. And it is many things and many wonderful things, but it's also sort of a tale of power and a morality tale around power, any kind of close-knit spiritual community around that, because everyone wants to be, a lot of people want to be ahead of it. And I feel very grateful in some ways because I felt like I got to see a lot of people go through their own little, rise and fall and becoming powerful and then losing it and then realizing they weren't who they thought they were. And I got to see that myself too. I saw my own power games and how I deal with power. And I feel like I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about other people. I learned a lot about what really helps, what helps other people. How does one adopt position of power without holding on to it in a negative way or getting off on it in a negative way? And that's an important issue for all of us. I mean, talk about conscious leadership, being able to adopt that position of servant leader, but at the same time, not to eschew power either, not to just, that's also important, to be willing to wield power in the important ways where necessary. We all need people to wield power in beneficent ways. That's important too, in politics, in business, in all kinds of areas. We can't just leave it up to someone else.
Such a great point. Beneficence and integrity and these ideas are so crucial. I'm going to pivot to something that you said that I thought was so important. I had the pleasure of interviewing Tiffany Schlane on what she calls a tech Shabbat, taking a full day off from tech.
A tech Shabbat, I like that.
Employing an ancient Jewish technique and she says one doesn't have to be Jewish to do it, that you any more than one would need to be, say, Hindu to, do yoga. But you talk about the importance of rest, and you cited a statistic that shocked me, and that was that the people who rise to the top tend to have better sleep habits.
Wasn't that fascinating? I thought that was just absolutely fascinating.
So
when I found that, I thought that, wow, that's amazing.
Totally. So let's talk a little bit about sleep and rejuvenation as it pertains to excelling.
Again, this is one of those areas where I think this is a kind of new shit has come to light. To say a little bit to honor Jeff Bridges, who I just saw has cancer. So we wish him well and healing. Oh my gosh,
wish him well. He's such a great guy.
Yeah, such a great guy. I got a chance to spend an afternoon with him and Bernie Glassman.
No, you didn't. You
actually
totally hang out with the dude.
I totally hung out with the dude. It was great.
He's the greatest.
For like 3 or 4 hours, just hanging out in Massachusetts, just like outside one fall afternoon, talking to him and Bernie Glass. It was so fun.
Oh,
and he's just like he just wouldn't know the difference. He's just like imagine you.
Just how you would hope him to be.
Exactly.
Oh man, I hope I get to meet him one of these days. But may he have a
be healed. Yes.
Recovery. Yes.
Yes. Right. Exactly.
But as you were saying.
Oh, new shit has come to light. Right. Exactly. My Big Lebowski reference.
Your Big Lebowski. You gotta do it.
So new shit has come to light. And I do think, and this is not something we understood fully 20 years ago, definitely not 40, 50, 60 years ago, is the power of rejuvenation and revitalization and recovery in all kinds of areas, in sports, in competitive sports, but also in competitive anything really. And certainly in being at the top of our game in business or in life, is the importance of rest and sleep and recovery and rejuvenation. So we have a whole chapter really talking about that and really talking about, the research on sleep is extraordinary, what it does for your system and a healing, for longevity, for health, for well-being, for being at the top of our game mentally. Sleep is extraordinary. We talk about meditation. I'm someone who's done a heck of a lot of meditation in my own life. Whether or not meditation is the specific practice we choose, and there are others we can choose, it's a very powerful way to rejuvenate, revitalize, and kind of clear our mind. But just this idea, there's this great quote in there, when everything works better when, like all computers that work better when we turn it off for a few minutes, including ourselves,
That's such a good point.
But we're not a computer. We don't run consistently like a computer. The rhythms of the human body, right? And the human soul, arguably, even are kind of our engagement and disengagement, creativity and quiescence, quiet and intensity and relaxation. And we have to remember that is the rhythm. If we want greater creativity, sometimes the answer is not to push harder. Sometimes the answer is to do less. If we want to be able to do more, sometimes the answer is to do less. Sometimes the answer is to back away. Sometimes if we want our mind to be more liberated, the best, and more creative, more liberated, more intellectually and psychically powerful and interesting and engaged, sometimes the way to do it is to empty it and to let it be free
Mm.
to let it be free of thoughts and free of, and to get the right kind of sleep, the right kind of revitalization. So understanding that rhythm and that balance and how our own systems work is critical. It is something that I just don't think was adequately understood a while back. So you want to be a great leader, you need to understand that piece of it.
I think that's such a great point. And what it allows you to do is zoom out and see the bigger picture, which is so crucial to being a conscious.
Well, the example I found when I found it, I was just like, wow, that's an incredible example. I mean, again, this is to serve not particularly some super high purpose, but in this case, it was just a great investment.
I was just thinking about that one. You want to share that one?
But Stanley Druckenmiller, who's one of the great investors of the last 50 years, he talks about one of his great successes was he never would have realized one of his great investments. It was around, I think, 2001. And he never would have realized it unless he took a 4-month break and did nothing and walked away from all news and walked away from all Wall Street noise. And then when he came back, he was so clear and had such a different perspective. It's like all the pieces fell together and he understood what was happening in a way he never would have if he'd been in the daily grind. And that made all the difference. And he made one of the best trades of his life, and et cetera, et cetera. And the rest is history, as they say. But those kinds of things, you can't underestimate. And it's so easy in the daily grind of it all to not appreciate that. There's something about just being in it day to day to day that almost we build a wall around our psyches and such that we don't appreciate it. And then when we step back, we go, oh God, this is great. I need to do this more. But so anyway, let's, being conscious of that reality is, and I love the beauty of that, understanding that rhythm and in our own souls and consciousness between quietness and engagement, between quiescence and creativity. And that understanding that deep rhythm is part of what it's like we're hooking into some of the deep kind of soulful rhythms of life. And the more we do that, the more we're going to feel ourselves and the more we're going to reach our higher potentials, whatever they are.
Such a good point. I'm finding myself remembering doing my own dissertation. And when I would take dog walks or watch a surfing film or take a shower, some of my best ideas would percolate, just stepping away from the project and then
and that's so back. True. So always so true, right?
Yeah. So it's so important.
We have to remember our consciousness is much more than our mental process, our conscious mental process, right? Our consciousness is deep and vast, right? I would say, right? And our conscious mental process is critical to it, but it's not the whole thing. So as we work on issues and problems and try to be creative and try to engaging with whatever the issues of the day are, we have to also provide time for those deeper layers of the self and for the more expansive layers of the self to have a chance to come to the fore. And like you say, stepping back, going for a walk, taking a shower, going for a run, working out, it both empties our minds and allows us to rejuvenate physically, but it also allows those deeper layers of our own creativity to actually engage on the problems of the day. I mean, like what you just said, how many people have said that throughout history in the way they've solved problems, whether a great physicist or a great inventor. It's just so true.
Love that. Well, I'm going to close with this big question. Given how much you've studied conscious leadership, if organizations began to implement conscious leadership just so widely that it almost became the rule rather than the exception to organizational leadership, what do you imagine the impact would be on the organization as a whole, as well as to the people, the stakeholders within it? What would happen?
Well,
this became the norm.
I think for any organization that really practices these kinds of principles, it's going to transform the culture of their institution. It just will. It will be a better place to work. It will be a more interesting place to work, a more creative place to work. The team camaraderie will be better. Ultimately, if they're practicing all these, the quality of the business will be better. The success of the business will be better. The creativity and innovation of the business will be better. In so many ways, the institution will become a kind of will become sort of energized with a kind of a higher purpose and a sense of possibility. This is not about just being, some virtuous world. This is also about creativity and innovation and engagement and learning and growth and development and purpose and profits and meeting the market and innovating. It's all of that. It's all of it. This is not just, it's not just trying to put a nice coat of virtuous paint over something that's not unchanged. It's like
Totally.
And so I think that's really important. And I think, and to step back at a cultural level, you ask about the stakeholders. Well, let's look at the largest stakeholders. And to me, this is important because, business has problems, a lot of problems in its own way. Our financial world, the critics of business are many today, and the critics of capitalism and the critics of Wall Street. And they're not all wrong. They have points to make. Sometimes I think they go too far and they don't understand the benefit and the positives of business and of capitalism in all kinds of ways. But to the extent that internally, business and the project of business and the creative becomes more ethical and becomes more obviously ethical and positive and more of a force for cultural development and evolution, the extent that it becomes more and more of that is the extent that people outside are going to feel less and less need to condemn it and to regulate it and to be concerned about it. So we need business to be a healthy aspects of society. There's different aspects of society. There's nonprofits, there's the government. We need each of them to kind of lead the way, and each of them have their own problem. Business can deal with some of its own problems by ethically evolving. That has a huge impact on institutions and society. That has a huge impact on what's around. So, that's the ultimate goal of this, is for business to kind of carry its weight on the project of society continue to evolve.
Well, I just heard Monty Burns from The Simpsons scream as you were describing all of these practices. I think that if those of you familiar with Monty Burns, the evil CEO of the nuclear power plant on The Simpsons, you will know that.
I forgot that. I've watched The Simpsons, but I'm not like a Simpsons aficionado.
He was not a person who would stand by this, but
he wasn't a conscious leader.
He was not a conscious leader. Well, he was conscious. He was conscious, just not the good kind. But I would corroborate that. I've seen a lot of business. I've seen a lot of organizations, including the nonprofits, and the attrition seems to go down. The morale goes up. The money goes up. The relationship with the community and the perception of the brand is improved. And the creativity, everything goes up. People don't have the shakes on Mondays. They're happy to go to work.
Yeah.
So I really hope that this becomes put into practice. I think that this is a great book. I think that the instructions are clear and a person can replicate what is being said in this book. Thank you so much for having written it with John Mackey and a third author,
Steve McIntosh. Yeah.
Steve McIntosh. And Carter, it's been just a total pleasure hanging with you and talking.
Adam, great. Thank you for asking such great questions and for allowing me to talk about so many different pieces of the book. So,
total pleasure. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.